Jake Morrison stepped off the transport shuttle and looked up at the massive silver towers that reached toward the purple sky of Kepler Prime. The Galactic Academy of Sciences stood before him like a metal mountain, its walls covered in symbols from dozens of different alien languages. He adjusted the strap of his worn backpack and took a deep breath of the thin air that smelled like copper and rain. The Academy had been running for over 3,000 years, teaching the brightest minds from 47 different species across the galaxy. Jake was the first human ever to walk through its doors. Earth had only made contact with the Galactic Federation 5 years ago, and most aliens still thought of humans as a primitive species that barely knew how to travel between stars. As Jake walked through the main entrance, other students stopped talking and stared at him. A group of tall, blue-skinned beings with 4 arms whispered among themselves. Near the information desk, creatures that looked like walking jellyfish floated in clear bubbles filled with glowing gas. In the corner, a cluster of insect-like beings moved together in perfect unison, their compound eyes all turning to watch him pass. Jake had studied basic information about the major species during his trip from Earth, but seeing them in person felt overwhelming. He pulled out a small device that would translate languages and followed the signs toward the administration office. The hallways were enormous, built to accommodate beings much larger than humans. Jake felt like a child walking through a cathedral. Dr. Veltar was waiting for him in the registration office. The Zephyrian professor stood nearly 8 feet tall, with crystalline skin that sparkled in the light, and 6 arms that moved independently as she worked on multiple data tablets at once. Her voice sounded like wind chimes when she spoke. "You must be the human," Dr. Veltar said, not looking up from her work. "Jacob Morrison from the planet Earth. Your species applied for cultural exchange status after achieving basic faster-than-light travel. Quite remarkable for such a young civilization." Jake nodded and waited as she continued working. He had learned that many alien species viewed time differently than humans, and rushing was considered rude in most galactic cultures. "Your academic records from Earth have been translated and reviewed," Dr. Veltar continued. "You will be placed in intermediate classes to start. We do not expect you to keep up with students from more advanced civilizations, but the experience should prove educational for all involved." She handed him a schedule tablet that showed his classes for the next semester: Advanced Quantum Mechanics, Strategic Combat Simulations, Xenobiology, Applied Mathematics, and Galactic History. Jake looked at the schedule and felt his stomach tighten. These subjects sounded far more complex than anything he had studied back home. "Your first class begins in 20 minutes, Dr. Veltar said. "Room 847. Advanced Quantum Mechanics with myself. Try not to fall too far behind the other students." Jake found his way to the classroom and slipped into a seat near the back. The room was filled with beings he had never seen before. A student with green scales and multiple heads was reviewing notes on a holographic display. Next to them sat a creature that looked like living liquid metal, constantly shifting shape as it thought. In the front row, a being made of what appeared to be living crystal was calculating equations in mid-air using beams of colored light. Dr. Veltar entered the room and began the lecture without introduction. She spoke about quantum field theory and parallel dimensional mathematics, concepts that made Jake's head spin. The other students took notes effortlessly, their various appendages moving in complex patterns as they recorded information. Jake pulled out a simple notebook and pen, the only note-taking tools he had brought from Earth. Several students turned to stare at him, apparently fascinated by his primitive writing method. He tried to follow the lecture, but the concepts were far beyond anything he had encountered before. As Dr. Veltar explained a particularly complex equation about quantum entanglement across galactic distances, Jake found himself doodling in the margins of his notebook. He drew simple diagrams, trying to visualize what the professor was describing. The student next to him, an insect-like being with compound eyes, kept glancing at his notebook with what might have been curiosity. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle becomes even more complex when dealing with quantum states across multiple star systems, Dr. Veltar was saying. As you all know, this limitation has prevented us from developing truly instantaneous communication across galactic distances for over 2,000 years. Jake raised his hand before he could stop himself. The entire class turned to look at him, and Dr. Veltar's crystalline features showed what might have been surprise. Yes, human student, I'm sorry. But why does distance matter if the particles are already entangled? Jake asked. I mean, if they're connected at the quantum level, shouldn't they react instantly no matter how far apart they are? The classroom fell silent. Dr. Veltar's 6 arms stopped moving, and she stared at Jake for a long moment. The mathematical proofs clearly show that quantum decoherence increases exponentially with distance, she said slowly. This has been established science for millennia. Jake looked down at his notebook, where he had been sketching simple diagrams of connected particles. But what if the decoherence isn't caused by distance? What if it's caused by the measurement method itself? The insect-like student next to him made a clicking sound that his translator indicated was excitement. Other students began whispering among themselves in languages his device couldn't identify. Dr. Veltar walked closer to Jake's desk. Explain your reasoning, human. Jake felt his face getting hot as all eyes focused on him. Well, back on Earth, we have this problem in engineering where the tool you use to measure something changes the thing you're measuring. Like, if you use a really heavy probe to test a delicate circuit, you might damage the circuit just by testing it. He held up his notebook showing his simple sketches. What if the problem isn't that entangled particles lose connection over distance, but that our method of detecting their state is too rough, like using a hammer to check if an egg is cracked? The classroom erupted in discussion as students turned to each other, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony of sounds, lights, and chemical signals. Dr. Veltar raised 4 of her arms for silence. This is a very primitive analogy, she said, but her tone had changed from dismissive to thoughtful. However, it does suggest an interesting question about our measurement protocols. Jake closed his notebook, feeling embarrassed. I'm sorry. I probably don't understand the advanced concepts well enough to make useful suggestions. On the contrary, Dr. Veltar said, her crystalline skin flickering with patterns Jake didn't recognize. You have just identified an assumption that no one in this room has questioned in over 3 centuries of study. As the class ended and students filed out, Jake heard them talking excitedly in their various languages. The insect-like student approached him at the door. I am Crix of the tertiary hive, the being said through the translator. Your thinking patterns are very unusual. These problems you mention, these measurement difficulties, my species has encountered similar issues in our research. Perhaps we could discuss this further. Jake nodded, still feeling overwhelmed by everything that had happened. As he walked toward his next class, he couldn't shake the feeling that his simple questions had stirred up something much bigger than he had intended. Behind him, Dr. Veltar was already making notes about human cognitive patterns and their potential applications to long-standing scientific problems. She had a feeling that this human's presence at the academy was going to complicate things in ways no one had anticipated. Jake had been at the academy for 2 weeks when he walked into Dr. Thesara's strategic combat simulations classroom. The room was different from the others he had seen, with a large circular platform in the center surrounded by holographic displays that showed star maps and fleet formations. Students sat at control stations that looked like the bridge of a spaceship, each one designed for different alien physiologies. Dr. Thesara was a stellar cloud being, her gaseous form contained within a shimmering energy field that allowed her to maintain a roughly humanoid shape. Her voice echoed from speakers around the room as she explained the day's exercise. Today we will be running the Siege of Altair scenario, she announced. This is one of the most famous battles in galactic history, where the combined fleets of the Zephyrian Empire were trapped by hive forces in the Altair system. For 3,000 years, military students have attempted this simulation, and there are 3 established strategies that can achieve victory. Jake took his place at one of the smaller control stations, its interface automatically adjusting to accommodate human hands and vision. Around him, his classmates prepared for the simulation, with practiced efficiency. Crix, the insect being he had met in quantum mechanics class, was linked to a specialized console that allowed the Hive Collective to coordinate multiple ships simultaneously. Zara, an aquatic oceanic whose species had mastered biotechnology, worked at a station filled with flowing water where her tentacles could manipulate controls in 3 dimensions. The 3 classical approaches are the Zephyrian mathematical solution, which uses precise calculations to predict enemy movements, the Hive coordination method, which relies on perfect fleet synchronization, and the stellar computational approach, which processes vast amounts of data to find optimal positioning, Dr. Thesara continued. Each method has been refined over centuries and represents the pinnacle of military thinking for these respective species. The simulation began, and Jake found himself commanding a fleet of 30 ships trapped in a system surrounded by enemy forces. The tactical display showed asteroid fields, 2 planets, several moons, and mining stations scattered throughout the system. According to the scenario briefing, previous commanders had tried to break through the blockade using superior firepower, outmaneuver the enemy through complex formations, or wait for reinforcements that would never come. Jake watched as other students began implementing their chosen strategies. Crix's ships moved in perfect formation, each vessel acting as part of a larger organism. Zara's fleet spread out like a living net, adapting and flowing around enemy positions. The stellar student, Neth, whose gaseous form flickered with calculations, positioned ships with mathematical precision based on probability calculations. But Jake was looking at something else entirely. While his classmates focused on the enemy, fleets, and their own ships, he was studying the asteroid mining stations scattered throughout the system. According to the scenario data, these stations had been abandoned when the battle began, but their industrial equipment was still functional. He pulled up detailed information about the mining stations and discovered they were equipped with massive rock processing systems designed to break apart asteroids for mineral extraction. The equipment included gravity manipulators that could move objects weighing millions of tons, and high-energy cutting beams that could slice through solid rock. Jake started moving his fleet toward the mining stations instead of engaging the enemy directly. Dr. Thesara's voice crackled through his console speaker. Student Morrison, you appear to be moving away from the enemy forces. The objective is to break through their blockade, not retreat to abandoned facilities. I'm not retreating, Jake replied, still focused on his controls. I'm getting better. Weapons. The other students had paused their simulations to watch what the human was doing. Jake's ships reached the first mining station, and he began using his engineering crews to modify the industrial equipment. Instead of using the gravity manipulators to move asteroids, he reconfigured them to grab enemy ships. The mining lasers, designed to cut through rock, were redirected to target enemy fleet formations. Within minutes, Jake had turned 3 mining stations into improvised weapons platforms. The gravity manipulators reached out across space and grabbed enemy vessels, holding them in place while the repurposed mining lasers cut through their hulls. Enemy ships that had been safely positioned behind asteroid cover suddenly found themselves being attacked by the asteroids themselves, as Jake used the mining equipment to hurl massive rocks at high velocity. The enemy fleet, which had been prepared for conventional military tactics, had no defense against industrial equipment being used as weapons. Their formations scattered as ships were grabbed by invisible gravity fields and pummeled by asteroids moving at incredible speeds. Jake's fleet broke through the enemy blockade in 12 minutes. The simulation ended, and the classroom fell silent. Dr. Thesara's gaseous form flickered rapidly, which Jake's translator indicated was a sign of extreme agitation or confusion. There must be an error in the simulation, she announced. The previous record for this scenario was 4 hours and 17 minutes, achieved by Grand Admiral Kelthar of the Zephyrian Third Fleet. No student has ever completed it in under 2 hours. Jake looked around at his classmates, who were all staring at him with expressions he couldn't interpret. Is something wrong? I just used the equipment that was already there. Dr. Thesaura began running diagnostic checks on the simulation systems. The mining stations were never intended to be used as weapons. They are simply background elements to create a realistic battle environment. But they were functional, Jake said. The scenario data showed they had power and their systems were operational. I figured if I was trapped in a real battle, I'd use whatever tools were available. Crix's compound eyes reflected light in patterns that indicated intense thought. Your species considers industrial equipment to be potential weapons? Jake shrugged. We consider everything to be potential tools. Back on Earth, we have a saying. If it exists, someone will figure out how to use it for something it wasn't designed for. My dad once fixed a broken water pipe using parts from an old television and some chewing gum. Zara's tentacles curled. In what Jake had learned was the oceanic equivalent of laughter. Your father combined communication technology with food products to repair infrastructure? Humans are really good at improvising, Jake explained. We call it thinking outside the box. If the normal solution doesn't work, we try weird solutions until something does work. Dr. Thesaura finished her diagnostic checks and found no errors in the simulation. Jake had legitimately solved the scenario by using resources that no other species had considered relevant to military strategy. In 3,000 years of running this simulation, no student has ever attempted to weaponize civilian infrastructure, she said slowly. The concept never occurred to our military theorists because industrial equipment and combat systems are considered completely separate categories. Word of Jake's unconventional victory spread quickly through the Academy's communication networks. Students from other classes began gathering outside the strategic combat classroom, curious about the human who had broken an unbreakable simulation. As Jake packed up his things and prepared to leave for his next class, Dr. Thesaura called him. Aside, Student Morrison, I am required to report unusual results to the Academy Review Board. Your solution will be analyzed by military strategists across the galaxy. I suspect this will generate considerable interest in human tactical thinking. Jake nodded, not fully understanding the implications of what he had done. He had simply solved a problem using the resources available, the same way he would approach any engineering challenge back on Earth. As he walked down the hallway toward his xenobiology class, Jake noticed that conversations stopped when he passed, and students turned to watch him with new interest. He was beginning to realize that his human way of looking at problems might be more unusual than he had thought. News of Jake's simulation victory traveled faster than he expected. By the time he reached his xenobiology class the next morning, he found a crowd of students gathered outside the classroom. They parted as he approached, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, and electronic tones that his translator couldn't keep up with. Inside the classroom, Professor Moresh was waiting with what appeared to be a guest. The professor was a crystalline being whose transparent body showed flowing patterns of colored light that indicated her emotional state. Next to her stood an ancient creature that Jake had never seen before, with skin like polished stone and eyes that seemed to hold starlight. Student Morrison, Professor Moresh said, her internal lights pulsing with excitement. I would like you to meet Council Member Quindara of the Galactic Science Council. She has come to observe your classes. Quindara's voice sounded like distant thunder when she spoke. I have heard interesting reports about your unconventional thinking methods, young human. I am curious to see how you approach scientific problems. Jake took his usual seat near the back, feeling uncomfortable with the attention. Crix had saved him a spot and leaned over as he sat down. The council only sends representatives when something very important happens, Crix whispered. Your simulation solution has created significant discussion among the military academies. Professor Moresh began the day's lesson. her crystalline form brightening as she addressed the class. Today we will be working on a practical problem that has challenged our best scientists for decades. How do we create sustainable ecosystems on barren worlds without transporting massive amounts of biological material across interstellar distances? She activated a holographic display that showed a lifeless planet with rocky terrain and thin atmosphere. The current accepted method requires terraforming equipment worth billions of credits, thousands of specialized ships to transport soil and organisms, and approximately 3 to 5 centuries to establish a stable ecosystem. The terraforming. Guild has refined this process over millennia, but the resource requirements make it impractical for most colonization efforts. Students around the room began discussing the challenge in their various ways. Zara's tentacles moved in complex patterns as she considered biological solutions. A group of silicon-based beings near the front shared data through direct electrical connections. The gaseous students formed a temporary collective to process environmental calculations. Jake pulled out his notebook and started sketching while he listened to the discussion. He drew simple diagrams of planetary surfaces, root systems, and bacterial colonies. The problem reminded him of something his grandfather had told him about farming during Earth's Dust Bowl years. "Professor," Jake said, raising his hand after 20 minutes of discussion, "why do we have to import everything? Why not start with what's already there?" Professor Moresh's internal lights shifted to patterns that indicated confusion. "The planets we wish to terraform are barren, Student Morrison. There is no existing biological material to work with." Jake looked down at his sketches, then back, up at the holographic planet. "But there's atmosphere, right? And minerals in the soil. What if instead of bringing in complete ecosystems, we brought in organisms that could prepare the environment for other organisms?" Council Member Quindara leaned forward with interest. "Explain your reasoning, human." Jake stood up and walked toward the holographic display, his notebook in hand. "Back on Earth, when farmers want to grow crops in damaged soil, they don't replace all the dirt. They plant special crops that fix the soil, then plant different crops that can use the improved soil to make it even better. It's called succession planting." He pointed to his sketches, which showed layers of increasingly complex organisms. "What if we started with really simple bacteria that could break down rocks and create basic soil? Then we could introduce plants that use those nutrients to create more complex soil. After a few years, we could add bigger plants, then small animals, then bigger animals." The classroom fell silent as students processed this idea. Professor Moresh's crystalline form flickered rapidly as she ran calculations. "You are suggesting that we use biological succession rather than complete environmental replacement," she said slowly. "Instead of imposing a full ecosystem, we would guide natural development processes." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. It would be like teaching the planet to grow life instead of forcing life onto the planet. We could modify Earth bacteria to work with different atmospheric conditions, then use those bacteria to create soil that could support modified plants, then use those plants to create conditions for animals." Zara's tentacles curled with excitement. "This approach would require perhaps 90% fewer transport ships. Instead of moving billions of tons of soil and organisms, we would only need to transport small quantities of specially modified microorganisms and seeds." The Silicon students began sharing data at high speed, their electrical connections sparking as they processed the implications. One of them spoke through the translation system. "Initial calculations suggest this method could reduce terraforming time from centuries to decades." Council Member Quindara's stone-like features remained unchanged, but her starlight eyes seemed to brighten. "This is a fundamentally different approach to ecosystem development. Has your species used this method successfully?" Jake scratched, his head feeling embarrassed. "Well, sort of. We use it for farming and restoring damaged land. But we've never tried it on a whole planet. I just thought the principles might scale up." Professor Moore-Esch was already connecting to the Academy's research network, her form pulsing with excitement. I am running preliminary models based on your suggestions. The resource requirements are indeed dramatically reduced, and the timeline shows remarkable improvement over current methods. She paused as data flowed through her crystalline structure. Student Morrison, your succession planting concept could revolutionize planetary colonization. I must contact the Terraforming Guild immediately. As the class continued, other students began approaching Jake with questions about human agricultural methods. They seemed fascinated by the idea that problems could be solved by working with natural processes rather than against them. During the break, Council member Quindara approached Jake directly. Young human, in my 3,000 years of life, I have observed the rise and fall of many civilizations. Each species develops their own approach to solving problems, usually based on their natural abilities and environment. She gestured toward the other students. The crystallines use mathematical precision because their minds process information like living computers. The oceanics develop flowing solutions because they evolved in liquid environments. The hive minds coordinate because cooperation is their biological nature. Jake listened carefully, sensing that something important was being explained to him. But humans appear to solve problems by changing the rules rather than working within existing frameworks, Quindara continued. This is extremely unusual and potentially very valuable. It also represents a significant disruption to established ways of thinking. Jake wasn't sure if this was good or bad news. I'm just trying to help solve problems, ma'am. I don't want to disrupt anything. Quindara's stone features might have shown amusement. Young human, disruption may be exactly what the galaxy needs. We have become very good at refining our existing solutions. But perhaps we have forgotten how to find entirely new solutions. As Jake left the classroom, he noticed that students were gathering in small groups throughout the hallways, their conversations focused on human thinking methods and alternative approaches to long-standing problems. He was beginning to realize that his presence at the academy was creating changes that extended far beyond his individual classes. That evening, as he worked on assignments in his dormitory room, Jake received a message that made him pause. Professor D. Moore-Esch had forwarded him a communication from the Terraforming Guild requesting detailed information about human succession planting techniques. Apparently, his simple farming analogy had already reached the highest levels of galactic science administration. Jake stared out his window at the alien stars and wondered what his grandfather would think about his farming advice potentially changing how entire worlds were colonized. The Galactic Science Council emergency session had been running for 3 days when Jake walked into Dr. Veltar's advanced physics class, completely unaware of the political storm brewing across the galaxy. Council member Quindara had returned to the council chambers with disturbing reports about human cognitive patterns, and representatives from major species were demanding answers about what they were calling the human problem. Jake noticed that his classmates seemed different lately. Crix had been asking him strange questions about human decision-making processes. Zara kept requesting explanations for human creativity techniques. Even Neth, the precise gas being who rarely spoke, had started asking about human intuition and how it differed from mathematical calculation. Dr. Veltar entered the classroom carrying a data tablet that seemed heavier than usual. Her crystalline skin showed patterns Jake had learned to recognize as deep concern. Today we will attempt something that has never been accomplished in this classroom, she announced. I am going to present you with the convergence equation. The room fell so quiet that Jake could hear the environmental systems humming in the walls. Several students made sounds that his translator identified as gasps or expressions of shock. For those unfamiliar with galactic scientific history, Dr. Veltar continued, the convergence equation is a theoretical mathematical proof that would unify all known physics. It would connect quantum mechanics, gravitational forces, electromagnetic fields, and dimensional mathematics into a single comprehensive framework. She activated the main display, and Jake saw the most complex mathematical expression he had ever encountered. The equation filled the entire wall, with symbols from dozens of different mathematical systems and notation methods he didn't recognize. This equation has been the focus of galactic scientific research for over 1,000 years, Dr. Veltar said. The greatest minds from every advanced species have attempted to solve it. Success would unlock technologies beyond our current imagination, including instantaneous travel across galactic distances, unlimited energy production, and the ability to manipulate matter at the atomic level. Jake stared at the equation and felt overwhelmed. The mathematics were so far beyond his understanding that he couldn't even identify most of the symbols. Around him, his classmates were studying the display with intense focus, their various forms of intelligence analyzing different aspects of the problem. Crix's collective consciousness allowed the hive mind to process multiple solution paths simultaneously. Zara's fluid intelligence flowed through biological approaches to mathematical problems. Neth's computational mind ran probability calculations at incredible speeds. Dr. Veltar, Jake said, raising his hand hesitantly, I don't understand most of these symbols. Could you explain what the equation is actually trying to prove? The professor's crystalline features shifted to show surprise. Student Morrison, this is the most advanced mathematical concept in known science. I do not expect you to solve it. I am presenting it as an educational exercise to demonstrate the limits of current knowledge. Jake looked at the equation again, trying to ignore the complex mathematics and focus on the underlying pattern. But what is it actually saying? Like in simple terms? Dr. Veltar considered this question for a moment. In very basic terms, it attempts to prove that all forces in the universe are actually different expressions of the same fundamental force. If true, understanding this connection would allow us to convert one type of energy into another, manipulate space and time, and control matter itself. Jake pulled out his notebook and started sketching, ignoring the incomprehensible mathematics on the wall. Instead, he drew simple diagrams of different types of energy and force, trying to visualize what Dr. Veltar had described. So it's like proving that electricity, magnetism, gravity, and quantum forces are all the same thing, just acting in different ways? Jake asked. That is an extremely simplified description, but essentially correct, Dr. Veltar replied. Jake continued sketching, drawing connections between his simple force diagrams. The problem reminded him of something his sister Katie had shown him during her high school science project about different forms of energy. What if the problem isn't that these forces are different expressions of the same thing? Jake said slowly. What if they're all responses to the same thing? The classroom went silent again. Dr. Veltar moved closer to Jake's desk. Explain your reasoning. Jake held up his notebook, showing his simple sketches. Back on Earth, we learned that what we call different forces are really just different ways matter responds to conditions. Like, heat makes molecules move faster, cold makes them move slower, but it's still the same molecules. They're not changing into different types of molecules, they're just responding differently to different conditions. He pointed to his diagrams. What if gravity, electricity, and quantum forces aren't different types of energy? What if they're all the same energy, but matter responds to it differently depending on scale, density, or some other condition we haven't identified? Crix's compound eyes began reflecting light in rapid patterns. You are suggesting that the equation attempts to prove unity where we should be looking for environmental causation? Jake nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. Instead of trying to prove these forces are the same thing, maybe we should be trying to understand what causes matter to respond with these different types of force. Zara's tentacles moved in excited spirals. This approach would treat the equation as a pattern recognition problem rather than a mathematical proof problem. Dr. Veltar was accessing the Academy's computational systems, her 6 arms moving rapidly across multiple interfaces. If we approach the convergence equation as an environmental response pattern, rather than a unified force theory, the mathematical framework changes completely. She began modifying the display, replacing sections of the equation with simpler expressions that focused on conditional responses rather than unified forces. Jake watched as the incomprehensible mathematical monster gradually transformed into something that looked more like a large chemistry equation showing different reactions under different conditions. "Student Morrison," Dr. Veltar said, her voice filled with something that might have been awe. "Your pattern recognition approach has eliminated approximately 60% of the mathematical complexity. Instead of proving that all forces are unified, we are now calculating the environmental conditions that cause matter to exhibit different force responses." Jake looked at the simplified equation and realized he could actually understand parts of it now. It's like a recipe that changes, depending on the temperature and ingredients you start with. The modified equation was still complex, but it no longer seemed impossible. Dr. Veltar continued working, guided by Jake's intuitive leaps about environmental causation and pattern recognition. Other students began contributing their species' mathematical expertise to the new framework. After 2 hours of collaborative work, Dr. Veltar stepped back from the display. The convergence equation had been solved. In 1,000 years of galactic scientific research, no one considered that the equation might be approaching the problem from the wrong direction, she said quietly. We were trying to prove unity, when we should have been mapping conditional responses. As news of the breakthrough spread through the Academy's communication systems, Jake realized that something fundamental had changed. Students and faculty were gathering outside the classroom, their various forms of communication creating a chaos of sound and light as word traveled about the impossible achievement. Dr. Veltar was already connecting with research institutions across the galaxy, sharing the solution and its implications. The technologies that would emerge from this breakthrough could revolutionize civilization itself. Jake packed up his notebook and prepared to leave for his next class, still not fully understanding what had happened. He had simply applied the same type of thinking he used for any complicated problem, breaking it down into simpler parts and looking for patterns. As he walked down the hallway, Jake noticed that every conversation stopped when he passed. Students and faculty watched him with expressions he couldn't interpret, and he began to suspect that solving the convergence equation might have consequences he hadn't anticipated. The emergency council session had reached its 4th day when the news of the convergence equation breakthrough reached the galactic capital. Council member Quindara stood before representatives from 47 species, her ancient stone features, showing no emotion as chaos erupted around her. Representative Zelkoth of the Mathematical Orthodoxy slammed his crystalline appendage against his speaking platform. "This is unacceptable. One primitive human has overturned 1,000 years of established science in a matter of weeks. Our mathematical frameworks are being questioned by students across the galaxy." Commander Vextar of the Military Coalition spoke next, her insectoid features clicking with agitation. "Our strategic academies report that students are abandoning proven tactical doctrines in favor of experimental approaches inspired by human methods. Military discipline is breaking down." Similar complaints came from representatives of the engineering guilds, the scientific institutes, and the academic hierarchies. The human student at the Galactic Academy had become a symbol of everything they feared about rapid change and uncontrolled innovation. But other voices spoke in Jake's defense. Representative Morthak of the Progressive Alliance argued that human thinking methods had already solved problems that had stagnated for centuries. The terraforming guilds reported that preliminary tests of human succession planting showed remarkable promise for reducing colonization costs. While the galaxy's leaders debated his future, Jake was packing his belongings for a scheduled visit, home to Earth. He had no idea that his academic performance had triggered a political crisis that threatened to split the Galactic Federation. Dr. Veltar found him in his dormitory room, carefully wrapping his few possessions in clothes that still smelled like Earth's atmosphere. "Student Morrison, I wanted to speak with you before your departure," she said, her crystalline skin showing patterns of concern. "Are you aware of the discussions taking place regarding your presence here?" Jake looked up from his packing. "Crix mentioned that some people are upset about the way I approach problems. I hope I haven't caused trouble for the Academy." Dr. Veltar's 6 arms moved in what Jake had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of a sigh. "Young human, you have accomplished more in 1 semester than most students achieve in their entire academic careers. You have also challenged fundamental assumptions that have guided galactic civilization for millennia." She sat down on the chair, designed for humanoid visitors, her tall frame folding awkwardly to accommodate the furniture. "Some species view your success as a threat to established order. Others see it as an opportunity for unprecedented advancement. The council is deeply divided." Jake finished packing and sat on his bed. "I never meant to threaten anything. I was just trying to solve problems the way I always do." "That is precisely what makes you so significant," Dr. Veltar replied. "Your species approaches challenges without the mental constraints that limit other civilizations. You question assumptions that we do not even realize we are making." Jake's transport was scheduled to depart in 2 hours, giving him time for one final walk around the Academy campus. As he wandered through the corridors he had come to know, students approached him with requests and questions. Some wanted to understand human creativity techniques. Others asked about intuitive problem-solving methods. Crix found him near the quantum mechanics laboratory, the hive mind's compound eyes reflecting patterns of what Jake now recognized as friendship. "Jake Morrison of Earth," Crix said through the translator. "Your thinking methods have begun to influence my collective consciousness. Individual members of my hive are developing creative thoughts independent of group consensus. This has never happened in our species' recorded history." Jake didn't know how to respond to that information. "Is that bad?" "We are not certain," Crix replied. "But we are eager to explore these new thought patterns. My species has requested permission to send additional students to study human cognitive methods." Similar conversations happened throughout Jake's farewell tour. Zara told him that oceanic scientists were experimenting with intuitive approaches to biological research. Neth mentioned that gaseous mathematicians were incorporating pattern recognition into their computational processes. The transport to Earth was comfortable but lonely. Jake spent the journey thinking about everything that had happened since he first walked into Dr. Veltar's quantum mechanics class. He had come to the Academy expecting to learn about advanced alien science. Instead, he had apparently taught aliens about human approaches to problem-solving. His family's reaction to his stories was exactly what he had expected. His parents listened politely, but clearly didn't understand the significance of solving ancient galactic equations. His sister Katie, however, immediately grasped what was happening. "So you basically taught aliens how to think outside the box?" she asked, while they walked through their old neighborhood. "I guess so," Jake replied. "I just answered questions the way I always do. I didn't realize other species think so differently." Katie grinned. "Jake, you've probably changed how an entire galaxy approaches science, and you don't even realize it. That's so typically you." When Jake returned to the Academy after his 2-week visit, he found everything had changed. The student body had doubled in size, with new representatives from species that had never participated in galactic education before. The curriculum had been restructured to include courses on alternative thinking methods and cross-species problem-solving. Dr. Veltar greeted him with news that the Galactic Science Council had reached a decision about human participation in galactic civilization. Instead of limiting human influence, they had voted to expand it. Earth was being invited to establish research institutes throughout Federation space, specifically focused on applying human cognitive approaches to long-standing galactic challenges. "The Council has realized that stagnation is a greater threat than disruption," Dr. Veltar explained. Your species represents something we had lost without realizing it, the ability to question fundamental assumptions and find entirely new approaches to old problems. Jake's first class back was Advanced Quantum Mechanics, now co-taught by Dr. Veltar and a new human professor who had arrived from Earth. The classroom was packed with students from species Jake had never seen before, all eager to learn about human thinking methods. As the semester continued, Jake watched his alien classmates develop skills they had never possessed before. Crix learned to think independently while maintaining collective connection. Zara discovered that intuitive leaps could accelerate biological research. Neth found that pattern recognition enhanced computational accuracy, but the most significant change was in how problems were approached throughout the academy. Instead of relying solely on traditional methods developed by their own species, students began combining approaches from multiple civilizations. The result was an explosion of innovation and discovery that exceeded everyone's expectations. Jake graduated at the end of the year with offers from dozens of worlds to help establish research centers and educational programs, but he chose to return to Earth with a different mission, preparing humanity for its new role in galactic civilization. The Academy's new motto, written in 47 languages, was carved into the main entrance. Question everything. A human taught us how. As Jake's transport departed for Earth, he looked back at the Academy and realized that walking into that first quantum mechanics class had changed more than just his own life. He had accidentally taught an entire galaxy how to think differently, and the universe would never be the same. The galaxy had indeed never recovered from one human walking into class, but recovery had never been the goal. Evolution was.